Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm delighted to have a fabulous panel with us here today to talk about how we can inspire civic innovation to have perhaps a little bit more of a human element. And I think we'll have the panelists come up. The first panelist is Alex Ryan. Alex is the Vice President of Systems Innovation and Program Director at the Mars Solutions Lab, where he brings diverse groups of participants together to jointly innovate on society's most complex and important challenges. He's the founder of the innovation and collaboration agency Syntheticos Incorporated, and he also co-founded Alberta's CoLab, the first provincial government innovation lab in Canada. He's an executive in residence at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, where he developed a new course, Designing in a Whitewater World. Our second panelist is Meighan Stone, who is currently a fellow at Harvard University. She is director of the Malala Fund. She served previously as vice president of communications and special projects at World Food Program USA, and as president of the developing group supporting the Global Partnership for Education's 2011 $1.5 billion replenishment conference. Meighan has led special projects in conjunction with the Clinton Global Initiative, World Economic Forum, 2010 FIFA World Cup, and at UN and G8 summits globally. At Bono's One campaign, she was communications director and then director of special projects, part of the team that helped build the organization in its early years. She's also served as a congressional fellow, media consultant for the World Economic Forum, and worked on HIV/AIDS projects in the office of President Clinton. A former campaign press secretary, Meighan has also worked on the Democratic National Convention and inauguration of President Obama. She is a member of the board for both Pencils of Promise and Good Labs. Our third panelist is David Bray, a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and Singularity University faculty member. Dr. David Bray was named one of the top 24 Americans who are changing the world, under 40 by Business Insider in 2016, and a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum for 2016 to 2021. He accepted a role of co-chair for an IEEE committee focused on artificial intelligence, automated systems, and innovative policies globally for 2016 to 2017, and has been serving as a visiting executive in residence at Harvard University since 2015. He has also been named a Marshall Memorial Fellow for 2017 to 2018, and will travel to Europe to discuss transatlantic issues of common concern, including exponential technologies and the global future ahead. Then we have Ruma, our next panelist, a business and foundation executive, entrepreneur, and best-selling author. She's a strategic counsel at Solve at MIT, an initiative to find tech solutions to the world's greatest challenges, as well as the Soros Economic Development Fund. Ruma was previously president of Chobani Foundation and Chobani Ventures. While there, she became founding president of the Tent Foundation, which she established as one of the leading foundations working to end the global refugee crisis. And last but not least, Peter Hirshberg, the founder of the Maker City Project. Peter is founder of the Maker City Project, the national organization tasked with helping cities and towns reclaim manufacturing prowess by leveraging the maker movement. He is co-founder of City Innovate Foundation, an organization formed with the San Francisco Mayor's Office, UC Berkeley, and the MIT Media Lab to promote a network of global civic innovation centers. As chairman and co-founder of San Francisco's Gray Area Art and Technology Theater, he's been instrumental in building one of San Francisco's most vibrant and civic-minded arts organizations, a center for digital media education, incubation, performance, and exhibition. As part of this work, Hirshberg pioneered the open data movement to foster transparency and innovation in cities, leading dozens of hackathons and open data events in San Francisco, Singapore, New York, Hong Kong, and London. During his 9-year tenure at Apple Computer, Hirshberg headed enterprise marketing, where he grew Apple's largest business and government revenue to $1 billion annually. So we're all here today to answer one question: how can we encourage community engagement and civic innovation and strengthen our democracy in a time of exponential change? As introduced, my name is Alex. I'm delighted to be with you here today. I am Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation, and we focus on promoting freedom and human rights where they're most at risk around the world. For many of the individuals that I work with, for example, perhaps in Belarus or Cuba or Saudi Arabia, citizen-driven innovation or civic innovation could potentially land someone in a jail cell. So I'm coming at this beautiful concept from the perspective of A, let's not take it for granted, and B, how I'd like to see us strengthen and grow this movement here in the US and elsewhere. An important note for our discussion: the basic Silicon Valley mantra that innovation and technology are good is not universally true. Technology, as many of our panelists would agree, is agnostic and can be used for good and bad. It can liberate millions, but it can also threaten democracy and civil liberties. Take the case of WeChat and its billion users, for example. In China, what we might call regime innovation has created a terrifying platform that all but erases privacy, allows near total surveillance, and allows the ruling Communist Party to use machine learning to predict citizen behavior and potential political crime. The same kind of system in China has created a type of credit score, now adopted by the two largest technology companies in China, that goes down if you exhibit any dissenting behavior. So I'd like to actually talk with our guests here today about how citizen innovation might be the difference between good and bad innovation, especially in this environment of exponential technology and rapid change. Citizen-driven innovation, or civic innovation, seems like it could prevent states and companies from gaining too much power. It seems to go hand in hand with civil rights and human rights and the goal of getting everybody in society the opportunity and incentive to participate. It seems like a critical tool that can help prevent the rise of authoritarianism. And it seems at first glance that we can strengthen citizen-driven innovation with an emphasis on things like an informed populace, open data, participatory design thinking, competition spurred by local government, entrepreneurship, and information security, all areas where our panelists have deep and wide experience. So we're going to start with Alex Ryan. And Alex, we want to hear about some examples of civic innovation that you're working on.
Thanks, Alex. So the map that we'll show shortly is a snapshot of a revolution that's been happening across Canada in governments, universities, philanthropies and businesses. In every sector of civil society, and particularly at their intersections, we're seeing the emergence of social innovation labs. If I'd shown you this map a decade ago, there wouldn't be a single dot on it. And if I'd shown you this map 5 years ago, there would be only 3 dots. So the social labs revolution in Canada is young, but it is growing exponentially. Here are 4 short stories from across our land. In Vancouver, In With Forward is a social mission business that embeds in marginalised communities to perform deep ethnographic research to transform frontline social services from the bottom up. For example, In With Forward has created Kudos, a platform that connects passionate citizens with people with cognitive disabilities to create lifelong learning experiences. Hundreds of learning experiences range from slam poetry to skateboarding, from mindfulness to metal stamping, and from tech startups to tour guiding. By encouraging lifelong learning and opening up access to stimulating development opportunities, Kudos is improving mental health, increasing independence, and finding meaningful employment for people with cognitive disabilities. By connecting people with and without cognitive disabilities, Kudos is also smashing through stigmas and reducing isolation. In Calgary, Civic Innovation YYC is a team within the City of Calgary that engages citizens in identifying and solving government challenges. The team has developed a platform for Calgarians to generate ideas and address public challenges. They also have a separate platform for city staff to identify innovation opportunities. So far, they have collected over 600 ideas from citizens and staff. The ideas are distilled into insights, and then citizens are invited to participate in design hacks, jams, and labs. And once evidence is gathered through prototyping in the real world, these ideas then go to Counsel for decision. And so this represents a completely different flow of innovation ideas from the citizens into the city. In Toronto, I lead the Mars Solutions Lab, which is a team within Mars Discovery District, a registered charity and North America's largest urban innovation hub. Mars Solutions Lab recently partnered with the City of Toronto to regulate the sharing economy. Our team started by observing over 130 people from across Toronto's transportation and accommodation systems. Starting with citizens, we took rides in Ubers and taxis, and we met with government officials and experts. We engaged in co-design sessions that brought together all of the sectors to create a vision of Toronto as a sharing city. Together, we developed recommendations, over 90% of which were adopted in the new regulations, and they create choice and safety for the public, reduce administrative burden, and promote innovation. In Ottawa, Inspire is an innovation hub within Natural Resources Canada, a ministry in the Government of Canada. Inspire has been piloting Deloitte's GovCloud concept. The idea is to repattern government thinking about talent for a digital future so that talent can be shared and accessed in a manner that parallels the way we're now using cloud computing and storage. NRCan recruits and provides permanent jobs to free agents who participate in an innovator's marketplace. Free agents take a psychological self-assessment and apply through a competitive process. They have specializations in public innovation, and their skills are recognized with open badges that create a new currency for talent. They are experts in emerging policy tools, such as crowdsourcing, behavioural economics, design thinking, big data and social media. The innovators themselves choose which projects to work on. They can join any team in any ministry, anywhere in government. The GovCloud pilot is generating more flexible career pathways for innovators, more agile talent for challenges emerging anywhere in government, and a potential mechanism for flexibly engaging citizen and private micro skills in service of public problem solving. What do these 4 stories have in common? They all satisfy my practitioner's definition of civic innovation, which is, civic innovation is any change initiative aimed at strengthening the relationship between citizens and their governments to create new public value. They invite citizens to jointly discover and frame challenges with government, as well as co-create, test, and spread new ideas that work. I think of civic innovation as a broad tent that includes open government, civic engagement, civic tech, and social innovation. Canada's social innovation labs are moving the needle on some of our most complex societal challenges. By doing this work with citizens rather than for them, we are also expanding and deepening democratic participation in affairs of the state.
Thank you, Alex. And what you've described is obviously a very rosy picture. There's a lot of potential and opportunity with civic innovation, especially in a country like Canada that always leads the world when it comes to indexes like equality and transparency and press freedom. But there's some challenges in this space too, and there's civic innovation going on in places outside of Canada and perhaps more challenging and tough environments. So Meighan, what exactly are some of the challenges that you've seen in this space?
So we're in the dreaded post-lunch session. Has anyone had to speak after the post-lunch session before? So everyone's got to help a speaker speak, right? So I know at the end we have questions, right? We're going to have some interaction with the audience. So if anything's triggering for you as you're hearing everyone share, I hope you'll think about that question and ask it, right, at the end so we can have a conversation. So just so I know the audience, how many people here traveled from overseas to this conference? All right, and how many are from the US, US-based currently? All right, so about half and half. Did anyone notice the last couple news cycles here in the United States, perhaps in Charlottesville? Yes. I think it's been really interesting to have some of these conversations both with other Americans and with my friends and colleagues from overseas about what's going on. So I think this question is really relevant for the people in this room. There's this convergence, right, that's happening right now between unrest, human rights, technology, and true civic engagement, which I would argue means representation. And I've heard a couple things so far at the conference. I had some thoughts. Is it okay if I put them aside and actually just talk about what we're learning today? I hope that's good. I'm getting some nods. So I've heard a couple things that are exciting. I am breathless about all the discussion about AI and technology and cannot wait to see it come to fruition. I actually started working as a coder when I was 19. I dropped out of college when that was not cool to do. That was not like a hip thing to do in 1994 to call your parents who had saved their whole lives to send you to college and tell them that you weren't going to stay, you were going to go work in tech. I could never have predicted how it all has come back around after all the work that I've done in human rights. And I spent the last 3 years working with Malala Yousafzai, who got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014. And I spent a lot of time working with activists who have to deal with issues around surveillance. They frequently have technology used as a tool against them in the work that they're doing. And as you said, when you opened, we take that for granted in other countries, even this country, where maybe we don't have to face that same set of circumstances. So I'm breathless about AI, but I think we also need to take a breath and I think confront some of the underlying assumptions and ask ourselves a couple questions. So I'm wondering if I can give you 2 questions, kind of call us into a prophetic space about thinking about what we're all innovating about. One is, do we really think that there's such thing as just purely good or bad tech? And is it going to be used by truly good or bad actors, right? So I've worked a lot in conflict and humanitarian crises. I've been to a lot of different summits where people are negotiating everything from trade to geopolitical conflict, and you learn really fast. There are very few really good guys and really bad guys. You know a really bad guy when you meet him, and you also, sometimes you meet those stellar people that have really laid it all on the line in service to higher values that inspire you, but most of the people fall in a really wide gray area in the middle, right? So I think as we're thinking about AI and tech, people from disenfranchised communities have some questions. They're like, wait a minute, guess what? The system that we've been working within up until now has not really worked for us, Colonial doesn't really work for us. The way that trade is set up right now doesn't really work for us. So we're a little concerned when you tell us that AI is going to start making decisions for us. Like, whose decisions, whose assumptions? And I think it's great to be hopeful. We should be hopeful about the positive use of tech, but I think we also need to be clear-eyed about challenges, right? So we shouldn't be fearful. No one should be a Luddite, but I don't think we should be fearless either. And I think sometimes at conferences like this, we have a problematic positioning, which is, I'll develop a technology, other people are going to come along and they're going to decide what the moral use is. That's not my responsibility. I would argue scientists don't function that way. They have institutional review boards. They have to think about the impact of the medical knowledge, technology research that they're developing. And we don't have to go too far back in human history, as recent as this morning, or even going back to the Nazi era where medical science was used as a weapon of war. So I don't think that we have to think too hard to realize this can be used in really concerning ways. The second question is just asking ourselves, are we taking seriously the kinds of teams that are developing technology if they are not reflective of the communities who will be using it or on who it will be used? Is that really going to work? And I would argue it doesn't. Of course, we bring bias and assumptions to how we design tech. And I think we need to really confront inclusion and diversity, not just because it's value-based. If you can't get on board with that, at least get on board about product development. Products are not going to work in communities if the people who are using them and utilizing them aren't part of those discussions. So I think we have work to do on both those questions.
Thank you, Meighan. And David, so we've heard a little bit about the promise and the peril of civic innovation. But either way, civic innovation is a way that citizens engage with their governments. Tell us more about the changing role of public service.
Sure, and I think I will continue the theme of this is a little bit like jazz, and so I'll try to build off the themes that have already been introduced by my two players already, if you allow me. Thank you, Alex and Meighan. First, I always like to ask the question, why are we here? And I think it's worth asking the question, why are we even talking about innovation in a civic space as being something we want to try and achieve? And I think for that, I'd like to go back to when supposedly the Constitution was signed in the United States. Ben Franklin is rumored to have said that he could rest easy knowing the great American experiment would continue to exist for the next 50 years. Now, obviously that was 240 years ago, but he used the word experiment because it was an experiment. I mean, in fact, actually for the next 100 years after the Constitution was signed, supposedly the British were actually having betting pools as to when US representative democracy was going to fail. And so that actually was a real thing. So I raise that because we may be due for some more experiments. And it's worth recognizing that the word experiment and expertise have the Greek word experia, meaning out of danger. The only way you get expertise is you do dangerous things, experiments that won't always work out. That then brings me to fast forward to World War II. How many people know of Ensign Nimitz? Ensign Nimitz, before World War II, back in 1904, ran his boat aground in the Philippines and was court-martialed, but not drummed out of the Navy. Instead, he was assigned to submarines, and 35 years later became one of only 2 5-star admirals we've ever had in the U.S. Navy, winning the war in the Pacific. Imagine nowadays a ensign or lieutenant with the U.S. Navy runs their boat aground in the Philippines. How long on Twitter, how long on Facebook would have been fire Nimitz? How many news pundits and comedians would have been, how could he possibly have done that? And probably him and his boss's boss would have been called before Congress and probably been drummed out of the Navy. In fact, it actually is now a Navy reg. You run a boat aground just once, you're automatically out. So while I celebrate that the internet is making things more transparent and more information, I do raise the question of, are we all now becoming armchair quarterbacks to what we think is going on, and therefore not tolerating people who are in public service taking risk? That also raises interesting questions about what is public service. I would submit that public service is no longer something that is done just by government professionals. Packet latency is no longer 4 days on horseback between Topeka, Kansas and Nebraska. It's milliseconds. How many people in the audience have a smartphone? I could ask the question how many people don't, but I don't want to embarrass anyone if you don't, and I completely respect if you do. That said, if you knew that your data was kept anonymous and private, and it was going to be used to inform and actually make your local community healthier and safer, how many of you would be willing to use your smartphone to collect information on, say, air quality, water quality, transportation quality? And I raise that because you don't have to if you don't want to, but I raise that because we can re-envision how we work together in public service because of the communication capabilities now in your pocket. According to some, if you have a smartphone, you have more computing power than President Reagan had in 1981 through the Pentagon. And the next 1 billion people on the planet that are going to get that computing power through a smartphone are going to get it less than $45. So to put it real, actually, I did have an opportunity to serve as Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission. as I like to put it, human flak jacket. And it was a nonpartisan capacity, but in 2013, we actually wanted to see if people would be willing to volunteer their broadband connection speeds so we could see if the providers were really giving you what you paid and actually what you were promised. Now, you can imagine saying, hi, I'm with the US government, would you like to download an app that'll monitor your broadband connection speed? Probably not going to succeed too much. But we made the code open source. We put it on GitHub. We made our terms and conditions only 2 pages long, and when was the last time you agreed to anything on the internet that was only 2 pages long? And if you looked at the code, for those who did, you'd actually see that we didn't collect your IP address, and we did not know who you were in a 5-mile radius. Now, most people didn't take the time to check the code, but a few groups did, and they actually came back and they said, yay, verily, they're doing what they promised. And it turned out that that was the 4th most downloaded app for a while behind Google Chrome on the iOS store. And so I share that because that's a model that could be used going forward in which we re-envision not just how technology makes our lives better, but also how we interact with each other and take things that had to be done in the past by government because communication and coordination were hard, and now can be done in a decentralized fashion by individuals who opt in and don't have to do it if they don't want to. I'll leave you with one last thought, and that's this idea of a Westphalian nation state is actually fairly new. It wasn't actually for most of human history that we organized by geography and gave sovereignty to geographical borders. In fact, it was only 200 years after the printing press. So should we not be surprised that the internet, much like the printing press in terms of how it distributes information, both good and bad, I 100% agree, information itself and technology itself is amoral. It's how we choose how to use it that decides whether it's good or bad. Should we not be surprised that the internet may give rise to new ways of organizing that may not necessarily just be nation-state ways of organizing? I worry, however, because what I'm seeing right now seems to be organizing by affinity groups. And if we organize by affinity groups with the insistence that you must think the way we do, regardless of whatever political aisle you're on, that's an autocracy of ideas that's just as bad as a dictatorship. So I think we've got to ask questions about how technology is impacting how we can organize, and then have conversations together as to how best we want to organize for the future ahead.
Thank you, David. And Ruma, we've talked a lot about how citizens will interact with their government, but what about the role of business? Tell us more.
Great. Tough act to follow. So I mean, civil society used to be defined as everything that isn't business and government. But now I think that people are starting to recognize that business can be a powerful force for social and civic innovation that can help solve big problems. And show me with a raise of hands how many of you here believe that business can really be a force for good. Excellent, my kind of audience. I mean, that's certainly been my experience over the last 2 or 3 years as I've been working around the refugee crisis. I was at Chobani where the company had hired refugees from day one at the behest of the founder, and you know, that came with a lot of controversy attached to it. He brought me on board to help him understand and figure out how we could do more and how we could take a more innovative and entrepreneurial approach to trying to end the refugee crisis, and so we set up his personal foundation called Tent. One thing that struck both of us as we started visiting refugee camps and refugee reception centers was the lack of innovation that had taken place in the last 30 years within the refugee sector. I mean, if you visited a camp or looked at images of refugee camps in the 1940s and you look at camps today, they look exactly the same. And what was also really interesting was the refugees, especially those coming from Syria, were using 21st century technology to navigate their way, and they were being met by fax machines, photocopying machines, and pencil and paper. There was no cell phone technology for processing, so you see these long lines just forming themselves where people are just standing around for days because, you know, the technology hasn't been implemented within these NGO sectors. And so our core strategy became A, trying to fund innovation, and B, trying to build a community and consortium of businesses who were willing to really put their core competencies in order to help solve some of the big challenges. Because businesses have the scale where relatively small efforts can have huge impact by just applying the core skill sets of a business to solve a problem. And I want to give one example of a company that we worked with that really demonstrates what I mean about with this, and that's LinkedIn. So one of the key issues once a refugee is resettled is helping them find employment. A refugee is a refugee until they find a job. Now, a lot of NGOs around the world were trying to build these employment platforms to attract corporates onto the platform and match that with refugees. And as we started looking at this, we said this platform already exists and it's called LinkedIn. And so we approached LinkedIn, and it turns out that there was a small group of them in Sweden that was trying to work on a project. And so we worked with them, and what happened after that was actually quite magical, because the LinkedIn team mapped out all the skill set shortages in Sweden, matched that with refugee talent, and then we connected with the Swedish government so that every time a refugee sought asylum, there was somebody helping them build their LinkedIn profile. And the success of that was not only great from a humanitarian perspective with the refugees, but it was also great for LinkedIn's business in Sweden. And with the success of that, we started thinking about scaling that to Canada and Germany. And we realized that working with businesses and partnerships with multi-stakeholders can have a huge impact in solving some of the key issues. I'm currently working with advising the Soros Economic Development Fund, where I don't know if some of you recall that George Soros made a $500 million commitment to invest in businesses that positively impact refugees. And again, that gives us a huge opportunity to try and prove how private capital can have a huge impact in a humanitarian crisis or in a civic crisis. And we're trying to look at this from a lens of refugees as entrepreneurs, refugees as employees, and refugees as customers. And so we welcome ideas from everybody because this is a new area, and we just want to keep on building the case for impact investing as it relates to crises around the world.
That's wonderful, Ruma. And I think, Peter, we've heard some of the challenges in this space. We've heard some of the success stories. We've heard how governments are involved. We've heard how businesses are involved. Tell us more about the city as a unit that might bring all this together.
When Alex showed his slide earlier of all the innovation centers going on in Canada, that is a worldwide phenomenon. If you look at how, whether it's in the smallest kind of place in Kenya or across the United States, the number of people who are at work on solving problems and putting the values that we have in this room, open innovation and experimentation and putting those to work in cities, we're kind of in this creativity explosion right now. I did a book last year called The Maker City that came out of work that we were doing in the Obama administration with 100 U.S. cities. And since then, just keeping track of the amount of work that's going on is staggering. So on the one hand, an amazing amount of innovation. And on the other hand, that seems to scare the shit out of a lot of people. And you can see that in kind of the populist reaction around the world and the fact that innovation communities tend to be homogeneous and a lot of other people don't know what to make about them. So we're sitting here with this interesting potential difference of great innovation, and these things all of our populations have to see themselves in the future, and I think that's the great work to do. I'll tell you a quick story. Several years ago in San Francisco, when we first opened our data, I was running an art and technology center here called Gray Area Foundation for the Arts, and it was a place where people came, and city opened its data, and we had the first hackathon, and there was transportation data and food data and crime data, and an amazing community of people showed up and started just solving problems. And what amazed me was we had software people and journalists and civic activists and bureaucrats all showing up in a room, and I'm like, what an amazing community. Like, there was a calling. They just kind of showed up and started working on things. And this is what made me start to realize that if there's an invitation, whether it's open data or here's a set of problems, when a city or a community issues an invitation, there's just, especially with the tools we have today, an amazing ability of people to come forth and going to want to work and wanting to work on them. And of course, this is what Singularity University is about. A few years later, we did a similar project in Singapore, and there was a question. Singapore had spent years telling its people, don't have too many ideas, we might cane you because we're top down. And the question was, if you ran an open innovation project in Singapore, would it work, or would people be frightened or not have the instinct? Well, the answer was there were communities of people who were at work on change, who were either activists or nonprofit people, and they had friends, and we filled a room with 300 people, and suddenly the government started to learn that this form of open innovation was great. Well, fast forward to now, and after having written a book on this, I get a call from Cape Town, and Cape Town's like, we're using the process in the book as a bottom-up form of innovation so that we can get a whole group of inclusive people working in economic innovation. Or Kokomo, Indiana. So on the one hand, there's a great deal of hope on this stuff. The flip side is, if you look at the last election in the US, you could argue that was about robots. Now, the president actually wanted to blame people with different colored skin and who look different, but this wave of innovation is scary. After the election, a bunch of us from Silicon Valley went out to the Rust Belt, which is a pretty distressed part of the US, and you saw huge amounts of economic isolation. The entrepreneurs had left town, people weren't sure what to do, and then the work that had to be done was how might we invest there or bring entrepreneurs back or help communities on their own figure out what they're really great at so that the kind of innovation we talk about can be shared with rural communities. Or even in San Francisco, when we did this work, we kind of ignored a lot of our own inner city and had to go through several iterations to engage people. So kind of where I come out on this is the tools that we talk about and the innovation that we do is powerful stuff, transformational stuff. And if we don't share it with anybody, we freak people out. And so the great work is how to think through and include. And that also includes using these innovation clusters to help figure out what new forms of employment are and how everyone can participate.
As we move to a little bit of a conversation, I think something I wanted to ask everybody on the panel is how we can incorporate the human element into this conversation. And we talk a lot about exponential technologies, but what about humans? And really, what's missing from the rest of the conversation here and at other events like the one Singularity University does across the world? I will just be very brief. I had the opportunity to go down and talk and spend some time with the GSP class earlier this month. And I remember being actually in the bathroom of one of the rooms at NASA campus, and there's a big mural on the wall when you're washing your hands, and it's got all of the world's challenges on it. So there's like climate change, and there's efforts to reduce poverty. But I noticed that, especially for me, I noticed that human rights was not included. And for me, that's something I would like to try and come here and address and add questions and challenges. So we'll start with Meighan because she actually asked us to do this. So start with you, put you on the spot.
Yeah. I think we have examples where tech works for communities and where it doesn't. And like the thing, does anyone here know Partners in Health, the organization Partners in Health, right? Yeah, they do incredible work. And these guys and women, Ophelia Dahl was also part of the group with the now president of World Bank and Paul Farmer, were real pains in the ass. Can I just say that? I mean, they were fighting at meetings. They said things that were really inconvenient. And this all came from a heartfelt belief that we need a preferential option for the poor, is what they used to always say, a preferential option for the poor. So I think for development of tech, that we say in these rooms is going to work for these communities, let's give them a preferential option, meaning let's give them the best tech. Let's find things that really solve problems. I've been to great hackathons. I've been to useless hackathons that will not help anybody in the communities we're claiming to help. There will be no solution that will reach them. And I would love to see tech developed as at least as tested and developed as a dating app that we will use in the United States to find a date this Friday night. Like, could that happen? Because that actually doesn't happen a lot of the times. We spend more money on those things and more time and more development than we do on things that we claim are solving the world's problems. So I think we need to own that. I also see places where it does really work in terms of community organizing. One American example was after the election, and very low tech. I think we shouldn't neglect that low tech solutions are good. We don't always need to build a new platform. There was a group of former congressional staffers that were upset about the election, didn't feel like they wanted to support the new agenda that was coming to the presidency in the United States, and they started a Google Doc of ways that you can work with Congress to resist the Trump agenda. The Google Doc crashes because millions of people try to download it. They just left it open. They started asking them, what do we do next? They're like, there's no next. Like, we just did a Google Doc. And so 4,500 groups start organizing independently, like lightning in a bottle. You could never have spent money to organize 4,500 groups in every congressional district in the United States. And so they said, you need to start to become an organization, and that group's called Indivisible, if there's anyone that has seen their organizing. So Indivisible just started with a Google Doc and I think a Squarespace website. So the barrier to doing work that actually listens to the community, that's the other part. It's that the tech can be great, but if it's not that back and forth, it has to be what you know how to uniquely do with authentic need and then measurable impact. And that sounds really obvious, right? But how many corporations and how many groups get some piece of that just tremendously wrong, and then it actually doesn't achieve its aim. So it has to be all three together. And
I wanted to ask you about that, Alex, because, do you ever build a framework or you build a lab or you have an exciting initiative and no one shows up? How do you make sure that people actually come out and activate?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like sometimes we can see engagement fatigue if government goes out and does too much consultation around policy change that is actually check the box kind of engagement. So the other challenge is that some of these kind of social lab processes, although we talk about being inclusive, they can actually be quite elitist because there's a relatively small number of people and they're generally very highly engaged people. So last year I helped to organise an event in British Columbia where we brought together 20 people from around the world to talk about democratically informed systems change. And so we're trying to blend the labs process with the field of democratic deliberation and civic engagement, and just finding that there are techniques from both fields that can really help us to ensure that as we try and deal with these really big disruptions and changes in societies, the big transitions and shifts, that we're giving people opportunity to engage with that at all different levels of engagement. And so you can look to examples like participatory budgeting that's happened to really empower people to be part of those processes, and you can start to build them into whether it's a tech discussion or whether it's a policy discussion as approaches that can really help us to make it much more democratic.
And David, you spoke to this a little bit before, but what might be missing here that can help build that trust between exponential technologies and all these crazy apps and then the user?
So the question of trust, I think, is key to any conversation about civic engagement, civic innovation, and public service. Back in 2000, I signed up for a little program called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. We were only 30 people out of 15,000, and we were there if a really bad day was ever going to happen. And I have to admit, there were times when I actually wondered, why does my job exist? Why wouldn't anyone ever use a biological agent? And I actually was it was scheduled weeks in advance, supposed to give a briefing to the CIA and FBI on September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning as to what we would do technology-wise if a virus event happened. Of course, unfortunately, 8/34 tragedy hit, and we didn't get to give that briefing. We responded to the events of 9/11. So down on October 1st, October 3rd, gave the briefing. First case of anthrax was up 24 hours later. It was a busy time. I raise that because I am concerned as a nonpartisan, and I've been a nonpartisan in my career, both in government but also outside of government as well, and observed increasingly polarization because I don't think people are working to build bridges of trust. And that's tied to a shared narrative as to why we are here. And I think that lack of a shared narrative is causing issues. I think, as Peter said, there are parts both in the United States but also in Europe and around the world where people have only seen technology take away jobs. And these are mainly in the rural areas. And so that's why they have a different narrative than possibly urban areas or we on both the east or west coast of the United States is we've seen technology destroy jobs, so we've also seen it create new jobs, and so we say this is part of the cycle. They've only seen it taken away jobs. And so it's not to say that they're wrong in their perspective, but what I think is lacking is a shared narrative and a bit of an empathy outreach to try and work with those different groups to try and figure out how can we come together on a shared narrative going forward. Because at the end of the day, it is going to result in social disruption. It's going to result in marketplace disruptions, loss of customer base. I do think the conversation about this makes good business sense to actually work together in a broader civic sense. But that question of trust is so essential because in this era of rapid change, it's worth remembering that for most of human species, we ran into 80 people in our entire lifespan, and those were immediate family members. I have no doubt you've run into 80 people or more at this event today that were not your immediate family members. This is terra incognita for our human brains. Human nature has not changed, our world has, and so we've got to figure out how we bring that trust and human dimension to the conversation.
And Ruma, you had mentioned to me that maybe a concern of yours was that all of the companies and individuals here who are on the business side, always looking at CSR or as making an impact as something that might do once in a while or might kind of separate it from their day job as being an area of concern and maybe a piece of the puzzle that's missing.
Yeah, I mean, I like what you said about bridges of trust. And Meighan, I couldn't agree with you more on the idea that there are some very bad examples of how technology hasn't had an impact. But I think that the root cause of that really is about the mistrust between the different players. And if business doesn't have the right partnerships with the NGO community, with civil society, with government, you won't be able to get the scale that you need. In the LinkedIn example that I gave you earlier, it actually worked because we partnered with the government and they were able to scale the program. I would encourage all of you to think about what are your personal core competencies in terms of thinking about what your personal contribution can be in any humanitarian or civic crisis, and what are your business's core competencies and how can you use that to really try to solve problems. But you're only going to fundamentally understand what are the problems in the field if you reach out to the people in the field to really know what's happening on the ground. And I just want to give one or two examples of what I mean from that. I mean, MasterCard developed a credit card for refugees so that when a refugee arrives on safe shores, the government can actually put money on that credit card. And suddenly the refugee and their family can buy their goods and resources and whatever they need. And that brings an element of dignity versus giving them hands out for food and telling them what they should be eating and what they should be doing. I mean, IKEA, with their flat pack expertise, was able to design a new way of developing homes so that refugees don't have to stay in tents where it's dangerous, where there's no light, and where any sort of climate hazard can blow the tent away. And so looking at what the core competency of a business is and applying that to solve some of the fundamental problems. I mean, I don't understand why we can't have cell phone technology for processing refugees because they all have cell phones. In camps in Africa, where women are being assaulted on a daily basis, one of the fundamental issues is that they don't have the ability to call for help because there's no cellular network in rural parts of these countries. Those are all solutions that if the right people came together, they could easily solve. So I encourage everybody to think about how can you use your core competency to solve the big issues of the world.
That's a brilliant point, and I would like to just go a little further there. When we at HRF work with activists around the world, we often see that the struggles they have would be so easily solved by the people in this room, for example. The White Helmets are an organization in Syria that basically are medical responders in a country where most of the doctors and medical professionals have been killed by the government, by the Russian forces, etc. So you have student volunteers who don't know a whole lot about medicine rescuing people from rubble and trying to save them. So what they actually need isn't money, but a good technology to be able to basically live video in doctors from other countries who are volunteering their time to tell these people what to do. So we've seen that by connecting the White Helmets to, for example, a large video conferencing company, when they get on the phone, they're like, oh, this is super easy for us. We can solve your problems very easily. So there are certain things that you may not think about, but all activist groups and by extension, people involved in civic innovation spaces and communities can benefit tremendously from what you're doing. So I just wanted to underline that point. Peter, I don't know if you want to bridge off that into what you've seen, in some of these communities that you've worked on. I mean, the friends you have here in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, I mean, don't you think they could do so much by just getting involved a little bit?
There's so much resource out there, but for the listening. I was doing a project a few years ago with the United Nations. There's a project at the United Nations called Global Pulse that uses kind of all of the effluent data, the data that flows out of your cell phones to go solve global problems. So for example, for public health to know there's an epidemic, people have to get sick, then they have to go to the hospital, then it has to get reported, and by the time all that happens, it can be a few weeks. In fact, when the SARS epidemic happened, the cell phones weren't moving because everybody was at home and sick. right? They're just not leaving their place. If you were able to intercept that stuff very quickly, you would actually know that there was an epidemic there and that people were sick. So part of what we were trying to do with the General Assembly was to explain to a whole bunch of ambassadors that were a little intimidated about big data that there was this resource that was flying around that if one could capture it and analyze it properly, you could anticipate an economic crisis or you could anticipate a health crisis. And there were, I'll give you a funny story about that. There was an E. coli outbreak in Germany a few years ago. I don't know how many of you remember this. And it was unfortunate because it killed some people. And Germany blamed Spain. They blamed Spanish cucumbers. They said the Spanish cucumbers killed people, which was particularly unfortunate for the Spanish because the financial crisis was going on, and they didn't need that on top of everything else. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, there was a startup that was focused on social media and epidemics, and they noticed that all the conversation around people getting sick were emanating from Heidelberg at a particular rate, and it looked to them like the epidemic was starting there. And to make a long story short, it turns out all of this open data, in fact, did pinpoint that. And the reason that Germany got it wrong was because they were only getting data from hospitals, and there were like 2 data scientists that worked for the health department, and that wasn't a lot of diversity. It was just not very genetically diverse because it was a couple of people with a couple of data sources and kind of a narrow view of the world. But so by expanding all of this, it turns out things got a lot better. And that's you don't even have to go make that resource. The resource was out there. It was capturing it. So that's a lot of the great potential that exists right now. The other thing is that boy, when you share these kinds of tools with people who don't expect them or are less fortunate, amazing things happen. So we talk a lot about inclusion here, but this is the reason that I call this book Maker City, and we focused on the maker movement, because today the tools that you give, I mean, you made the point earlier about the cell phone power, but the tools that a 14-year-old girl has in terms of manufacturing and design are the tools that industrial people had a few years ago. There's a school in Cambridge, Massachusetts called the New View School, which is kind of a maker-style academy for basically kids who don't do well in regular school. And I was bringing a guy by there from the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Dubai, and a 14-year-old girl and the guy she was working with were given the assignment of solving a problem for disabled people in cities. And this woman basically, the guy from Dubai who came in heard that kids were solving problems, and he's like, you mean they're putting photos on the internet or they're selling pictures? And it's like, no, we give them a thorny problem to solve, and this woman takes him through the whole problem that she solves and the design process, and he's like, I have a 14-year-old daughter at home. I had no idea that 14-year-old girls of the human species could solve these kinds of problems, right? So we live at this moment where right when we're worried about robots obsoleting us, we have more capability than ever. And when you take this stuff into disadvantaged communities, people just light up, and that's like, all of us can do that. And it's not that difficult to do. And by the way, you spread just a little bit of that hope and you start reversing a lot of the anger and the populism and the stuff that's going on.
David, our prompt is asking us, how do we strengthen our democracy in a time of exponential change? And earlier I started to ask you, well, what are going to be the implications of different types of exponential technologies? And you sort of said, wait a second, hold on. Let's actually talk about the human relationship first.
So I'll be honest, I don't have all the answers, but I will think that hopefully we, with Singularity University and ongoing conversations, can actually talk about the fact that it's not a given that representative democracy or being a republic will continue to exist as an effective method 10 to 15 years from now. Again, as we sort of already talked about, one, there's the technology side, but there's also the thought that I'm working with Vint Cerf on a thing called People-Centered Internet, which is recognizing the internet has not evolved as being as people-centered as we would like it to be. And that is a concern, that it actually may be distancing ourselves, and that distancing now when we engage online actually makes things more rude as opposed to more positive if we were face-to-face. But there's huge opportunities too, because now you can actually bring together billions of people, which if you tried to put a billion people in a room would be challenging. But I think we've just got to figure out how do we do those experiments to figure out how we do represent a democracy or republic, and recognizing some nations may choose right now to look at what's going on in the West and say, why would I ever want that? And choose, Singapore is a benevolent dictatorship. And so, but we've got to have that conversation, because I personally think the challenge of the next 10 to 20 years is really going to be, does an individual have the ability to make choices relative to the collective, or does the collective make choices for the individual? And that, I think, is going to be a tension. It's not saying we don't need communities. We definitely need communities. Obviously, I'm biased because of the way I was raised. But we need to have those conversations and figure out those experiments, because more information does not necessarily mean more transparency. If anything, it may mean more information means both disinformation and also confusion about what that information means.
Which was a big unintended consequence.
Oh, yeah.
We all thought
Yeah.
that more information, Marshall McLuhan, when he wrote Understanding Media, and he talked about the global village, a lot of people thought what he meant by that was kumbaya, we'd all understand each other, it'd be good communications. He actually said, no, it will tribalize us, it'll actually create discord when everyone knows everybody else's business, it doesn't get a whole lot better, and we've seen that in spades in the last few years.
Right.
And it's also worth pointing out that at the end, in the last industrial revolution, and at the end of the Gilded Age, there were huge corrections we made to capitalism. And, like in the United States, all the child labor laws and the health laws, and I mean, that was a big mid-course correction. And this whole populist thing we're going through now is calling for a mid-course correction, and it either goes in a dark direction or we use our design capabilities to come up with something that looks a little different than what we have.
And I'll give real quick one pessimistic note and one optimistic note, because I want to end on a good note. Pessimistic note, we are still, at least in the United States and other countries, living with the institutions that came as a result of World War II. I would hope we don't have to have another world war to create new sets of institutions, but these things happen in punctuated equilibrium. The optimistic note, I was actually just sort of thinking here, apologies for haiku, public service is all that we, the people, choose to do together. And I want to just end with that note, because we need to have conversations. What things beyond that we do individually are things that we do just in a corporate sense or a business sense? What are those things in the internet era, the exponential era, do we want to do together?
And Meighan, we were talking a couple days before the events at Charlottesville, and you had mentioned that you were hoping we could focus a little bit on the relationship between, let's say, activist groups. You mentioned Indivisible before. Where, in your mind, is how can civic innovation encompass all of these people? Some of these people? Are there going to be limits? Where's this in your mind?
Well, I mean, I hear sometimes people say things are getting worse or better, and I'm always want to ask, like, who's worse and who's better, if we're talking about Charlottesville in the U.S. context, the experience of communities of color, whether it's anything from police violence to other circumstances, are finally coming to light now because people can document the injustice that's happening and are making great use of technology to call attention to stories that were just ignored before because the local paper had nobody of color on staff or nobody of color was an editor, and they just decided this wasn't news, and they said, great, I'm going to put it on Twitter. Sadly, a dear friend of mine was in Charlottesville actually on the street. If people saw the footage of the car in an act of domestic terrorism that killed an activist and injured 20 others in Charlottesville, my friend was the one that took that video. And I saw him put it on Twitter, and it went viral within just a few minutes. It was across every TV channel you can imagine, and he started doing back-to-back interviews talking about that this was an act of domestic terror. I'm going to say what it is. I'm not just going to use the word terror to talk about what happens if there is a Muslim perpetrator. This is terror. It was a white man in a car hitting activists. I'm going to say what it is. And he helped shape the narrative of the news cycle by doing that. He was on every news channel. I think that's a great use. But I think the core question is representation. It's not just enough to quantify more responses or more people on a platform if we're still not finding a way to bring the voices of all people who are impacted by laws and government and the change we want to see, then that tech isn't working, I would argue. And I think we see this interestingly even in Twitter. There's Black Twitter is very different from other engagement we see on Twitter. We see different groups use different platforms in different ways. And I think the question is, how do we make the technology work to represent everyone's views? We have a systems problem with voting in the United States. We have a customer problem. Almost half the customers don't show up on election day. That to me is an issue that we need to solve. Why is it so hard to vote? Actually, I'll close with this. There's a woman who keynoted at Lesbians Who Tech this year. Her name's Deborah Cleaver. She started a group called Vote.org. Lord knows how she talked the person that was cyber squatting on that URL off of it into giving it to her, but she did. She got Vote.org back, and she registered more voters at a lower price point than any of the campaigns, any of the existing groups that have been around forever. And she's a really small team. She likes to say that her CTO is her cat. It's a very small team. So she did it. She's cracking the code. And I think we need to find more ways. But I think when we see diversity in leadership, we see diversity in ideas. And I think we all can agree as technologists that we need different ideas. That's how you solve problems. So who's in the room, and then how we're measuring impact and data, it really, really matters.
And Alex, to the theme of our responsibility of trying to answer this question of how can we strengthen democracy, what are some lessons from Canada? I mean, you guys have way higher voter turnout. I mean, tell us.
Well, I'm an Aussie, so...
Well, then you have even higher voter turnout.
That's right.
Because you have
Is
to
it
vote.
I was going to say, is it legally required that you have to vote?
Yeah, one thing I would just say is that I think the social innovation labs movement that I was talking about is... I feel like we're at risk of losing the ability to talk to one another, particularly when we disagree on polarized issues. And I feel like this lab movement is kind of showing a way where we can actually bring people together who don't have trust and don't agree with each other and don't see the world in the same way and still make innovative progress anyway. But it's very slow and it's very expensive and it's very costly. So I often think, like, what's the Model T of the Innovation Lab? How can we take these labs that are expanding across Canada and across the world, and how can we actually make that something that is accessible to every person so that we can start to design platforms for people to have these conversations democratically on their own?
That's a very cool question, because there is so many models of these innovation labs going on right now. It's like the Cambrian explosion of innovation labs, and trying to just keep track of the best ways and how to duplicate them and how to reduce the cost of these things. It is a moment in time.
Actually, I have a question for Alex real quick. How much does context? Do you find that the context of the problem defines the type of approach or the innovation approach you need to do it, or can different innovation approaches scale for different issues?
Yeah, it depends. It's contextual.
Yeah.
But this idea of the Cambrian explosion, all of those labs on this map, and Nesta has a world lab map, there is no it there. There's no one model that they're working. There are common tool sets and mindsets beneath the lab movement, but it is not an algorithm yet that you can replicate and scale across areas. So broadly what we're seeing is when governments take this on, it's coming usually from a service design lens, looking at the major cost centers in government and saying, how can we provide a better user experience? Because from the civilian world, the tech world, the commercial world, people now have expectations that government can't meet. So how do we provide that same kind of user experience at a reduced cost, so we reduce the burden of government services? That's the point where we're entering traction, and I think that bit is quite well known. There's a good discipline behind it, there's good skills, and the same with behavioural insights on the nudges and all that kind of stuff. Those are things that are rolling out quite well. But when it comes to policy development, like the big questions of like, should we be doing this, or they're the ones that I think is really still in an unknown space, and those solutions are very bespoke solutions relative to a context.
And just to finish, so Ruma, you had mentioned, at the same time we have this explosion of interest and potentially investment in civic innovation, you were saying that some of the people that you worked with who have the least and who are basically driven from conflict and dictatorship have exponential technology. I mean, they have what we were talking about before, the power, the early 1980s government on their phone. How does this change things?
Well, I think first of all, thanks for bringing that up. I think first of all, the important challenge to recognize is that, as we're designing programs and policy and innovation, we have to take into consideration what our customer actually feels and thinks. So knowing that the 65 million refugees around the world who had to flee violence, a vast majority of them do have cell phones, there's a way to engage with them and understand what they think and really design a program that benefits them in a meaningful way. I think what struck me the most when I first started this work is looking at policy documents and realizing that the policymakers had never met or spoken to a refugee in their lives. And we engaged a research firm to go and get us some opinion research on how do refugees feel they are welcome in their host communities. And what we realized is that this had never happened. And the refugees were just so surprised that people actually cared what they think. So whether it's refugees or any other constituency, it's so important to hear their voice and design policies and programs that bear their needs in mind. Otherwise, we're just going to go on in a circle. I mean, I just want to give an example. Meighan and I were both at the Syrian Donors Conference a few years ago, where countries from all over the world were pledging money for programs, and there wasn't a single Syrian or a refugee in the audience to speak to this. So it's so important to take into consideration the voices of the community we're trying to serve.
I think it's a great point to end on. We're going to open it up to questions. There's going to be a mic coming around.
Hi. So this is mainly for David, I guess, but you were talking a lot about experiments. So I'm very curious about setting out the ground for these experiments on democracy. So let me give you a tiny bit of context. I'm from Venezuela. So right now we're in a difficult situation. I don't even know how I'm going to get back here. So, but anyway, I could tell you a lot of stories. But since the protest started, we've been thinking about lots of things. What's coming after Maduro's regime? So we've been talking about we don't have all the answers, not even all the questions. So how can we establish Venezuela, let's say, as a crowdsourced country? Open source country and open innovation lab for the world, because, well, we had a very interesting place to test bold ideas. It's kind of like coming out of the war, just like you say. Our institutions are on the ground. They don't work for anything. And also, let's say yesterday I was talking about with Jamie, the fire and stuff. So talking about decentralized autonomous organizations and thinking about decentralized autonomous countries. Those kinds of things, I don't know. I would like to meet everybody here soon.
Right. So one, you have all my great respect and everything, and you're absolutely right. That's an amazing opportunity and an amazing challenge at the same time. I'll give you two concrete examples that I've seen that might be useful in your context. One, there's a group called G0V.tw. They're in Taiwan, so if you Google them, you can find them. They initially started off about 4 or 5 years ago doing open source software for protest movements. And then when the Taiwanese government changed, they actually invited these they actually had day jobs, but they were writing open source code on the side. They invited them to actually help make their government better. And so, for example, they had been doing text alerts for like tsunamis and typhoons, and it turned out they could do visual alerts, or they come up with better ways of getting the app out and information out. And so it was people that had day jobs already, but they were willing to come together. And I think both the tools, for the interesting thing they actually did also, with the protest movement tools, they converted those tools to actually deliberate on how to make the government better. So it wasn't that they were necessarily protesting against the government, but it gave a forum, and it actually did use phones and cell phones, because not everyone has a computer. So that would be the first thing. Now, I recognize that may still be a little too techy, but that may be sort of the first approach. The second one, actually, I've seen in Australia, actually. They're doing a thing called it's your high horse, where basically everyone gets 1 minute to get in front of a camera and to express their views on an issue. And then they have people that actually then codify what they're doing. And what it is actually both one, giving voice to the people, because you're right, none of us have all the answers, and you start at the local level. However, two, it's actually been shown that if you begin to get engaged on an issue and you feel like your voice is being recorded and being heard, now you're more invested in the solution. You're not just distanced from it and saying that's someone else's problem to solve, or they're all silly, they're all stupid. So those would be two concrete examples I might raise for you to think about.
Thank you. Next question, right there. Oh, back there.
Oh, it's
We'll go to you next.
Thank you. All right. So, getting into the techie point, I am very excited about the points that we have seen on AI in this conference. So, there's a couple of amazing stuff that is going on, but in government, I feel there's still a gap for some projects to be done. So, I will just get a little bit of a glance of what's your take on AI for public administration, open data, for that to be doable, and what will be your roadmap for AI to be really ingrained on public participation and also in how policy is made. So if you have any takes, I know which of you would like to take that answer.
You want to do it?
Right,
Yeah.
So I guess I'm the AI good person. So I've done a lot on public service and how it's going to be impacted by artificial intelligence, and it can be both amazingly good and amazingly bad. I think we mentioned some countries that are using it to surveil their citizens, and hopefully that doesn't happen for the Western world. Two things I think we need to think about. First, Meighan made the great point. If you don't have representativeness in the data that's being fed to the machine, don't be surprised that it makes really bad decisions. As anyone who's done computer science, garbage in, garbage out. How many people have heard of a thing called FaceApp? You can download it if you want to. I might not recommend it, but it's up to you. They had a challenge where this was being fed data to help. It would basically cartoonize your face, and there was the option to hit beautify. And unfortunately, FaceApp is based in Russia, and the data that was fed into it was non-representative. And so when anybody of any skin complexion hit beautify, unfortunately it made everybody's skin lighter, which is completely wrong. That's an anathema. That shouldn't be doing that. But it was fed incorrect data, and the machine made the wrong conclusions. I think we're going to need thinking about, both for government organizations, but also for corporate institutions and just nonprofits, we're going to need to, one, have awareness of when is machine learning, when is AI being used to make a decision, and in what context, and what data sets is it using, and that needs to be made public if we're going to be made free. But the other thing is we're going to need the equivalent of ombudsmen, ombudspersons that are looking at the data being brought in to make sure it's not some segment that is non-diverse and leading to wrong conclusions.
Do you want to weigh in? Yeah.
Yeah, I would just say, so Meighan Smith is a good friend of mine who used to be, she's the first woman who was CTO here in the US, right? And I was at her house one night at her kitchen table, as she likes to do, have everyone over and talk about big ideas. And there was another young staffer there who told me she was the only one in the CTO's office that was responsible for AI policy in the White House. It was one person. So I would say all of the folks in this room, no matter what nation you're from, you need to be engaged with the government where it's safe, where it's appropriate. If you're able to do that, because, I mean, think about, I can say in the US context, if you go to Congress and try to talk about net neutrality, like, good luck. Like, the lack of technical knowledge is so profound. And I think we have a real issue where the tech is far outpacing government's ability to understand or legislate against it, right? And sometimes government legislation, and we all know, is constrictive and gets deeply in the way of innovation. Sometimes we need government and laws to protect us in areas like privacy and other regards, and that's really important, and I think it's vital. So I think we're gonna have to figure out how to do this, but I think right now the tech is already, I mean, anyone who's in AI is like, sorry, like, it's already outpaced. Good luck, you need to start running now to catch up, and you probably will not. And I think that's a really interesting moral government question, and I think that's where this community has to figure out, how do we work with government that is often problematic, but sometimes really deeply needed. And if we think that AI is divorced from power dynamics and how it's gonna be used, we're kidding ourselves, right? So how do we do that? And how do we even talk to each other when you're sitting with a 70-year-old legislator who can barely operate their smartphone about some of these issues? Like, for real, has anyone sat in these meetings? They're tough. Like, you know, it's really hard to get a joint understanding of what's needed and what the gaps are.
We'll take the last question.
Hello. Hi, my name is Jane, and I'm actually really happy about this panel that there are. I didn't even realize because, first of all, I actually started with Indivisible Time. I was one of the founding members in Taiwan. And then,
Thank you.
And then David just mentioned Ling Zhenfu, I believe, right? Ling V. Which I found, so I just founded a company called Build Great Bridges, BG Bridges of Trust.
Excellent.
Yes, and it was actually grew out of, I met the current business development manager at Jiling V Hackathon. There were no engineers that wanted to talk to me yet because it was just a concept, but he wanted to talk to me, so this is great. So then, and I went to the Fletcher School, so I just noticed that. But I wanted to, more of a sort of question invitation, because sorry, what's your name again? Okay, let's see. Ruma. Yeah, sorry about that. Ruma. So Ruma was mentioning core competencies. What are your personal core competencies and what are your business core competencies that can be applied to solve problems in the world? I feel like that's a way better way to say it than what we've been saying, but what we've been saying is the same thing. And I saw Meighan was in the room last night when we were talking, when I mentioned this, because my company is trying to build an interactive ecosystem to invite everyone to kind of build these resumes that are based on core competencies. So I wanted to I guess, invite / ask if you guys would be interested, because it is sort of like a profile-based system where both individuals, people and organizations would be part of it to share best practices. And the vision in 10 years would be we build these offline and online local hubs where you share best practices between the hubs. It's kind of like a social innovation talent Olympics.
So Ruma, do you want to?
where you
Finish us
kind of
with
compete
that.
with each other to attract and retain the best minds to work on the most social innovation for your hub. So it's kind of like an Olympics, a co-opetition.
Well, first of all, congratulations for taking the initiative to do something like this, because I think the more examples we have of people really stepping up and creating these hubs around the world, the more best practices we'll have in place to turn to. I would be more than happy to sit down with you and sort of walk you through who are maybe the top 50 or 100 companies that I've seen who could be really beneficial to join this system. So if you want to come and see me after, that'd be
Wonderful.
great.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you have some new ideas and some insight into some of the challenges and opportunities in the civic innovation space. Thanks so much to all of our panelists for coming. It's been a great conversation, and I guess we'll finish up. Thank you.
Thank you.